Welcome everybody. My name's Viv Adams from the Parliament and Government Affairs team at the ICO Wilmslow office, and I'll be joined today, who'll be assisting me with questions, by my colleague Jenny Brocci from our Edinburgh office.
Hi everyone.
We've called this session, and as you can see in the picture, the Data Practitioner's Guide to the Data Sharing Galaxy. Practical tools to help you decide when to share data. We gave this name to it partly to help you decide when to, partly to grab your attention, but also because of the breadth of the new resources we've created. The seminar will also highlight work on further resources that we'll be adding to the hub. You're welcome to ask questions in the chat box throughout the session, and we'll look at these at the end of the seminar. This is a short session, which is why we're running 3 seminars, and we probably won't have time to answer all of them in the session due to time. We'll aim to pick up the most salient ones in the session. For those we don't have time to answer, after today, we'll aggregate the questions received and feed them and our responses into our data sharing information hub to ensure that the main issues are covered. So keep an eye on the hub on our website in the coming weeks. We're keen for you to participate in our data sharing work, as I'll emphasise in this session and have emphasised in the other 2 sessions today. And we want to develop the hub into a resource that is relevant, reactive and live. During this seminar, we aim to raise awareness and understanding of the new data sharing code. We also want to run through the practical tools and resources within the code and in the data sharing hub, information hub, and promote confident, proportionate data sharing. In fact, many of these have been our aims throughout today. To open our session, we'll start with a quick question for you, which we'll return to later. This is a simple opening question, not a test. You should answer it by using the means that you were given at the beginning of the day. So how much do you know about the resources provided in the code and in the data sharing information hub? A, no idea. B, a vague idea. And C, I know where they are and I know where to find them. Whatever your answer, and we'll look at your responses later, this session should help to explain what the tools and resources are and where you can find them. The Data Protection Act 2018, DPIA 2018 for short, requires the Information Commissioner to prepare a code of practice providing practical guidance on data sharing, and this is what guided our production of the new code. We wanted it to be practical guidance. The new code was published on our website on the 17th of December 2020. We expect it to be laid before Parliament soon. As I've said, we're required to produce a code of practice providing practical guidance. In the first data sharing session earlier today, we explained the structure of the code and how you can use it to help you find the information you need. In this final session, we'll look at the accompanying resources we've produced. Now, the presentations will be available online on the ICO website later, if you wish to catch up on anything. The new code, as I've said, follows the DPA requirement to provide practical guidance. It is structured and written to help you find the information you need on data sharing, as discussed in the first seminar. We've included a guide to navigating the code, which is within the code and also in the information hub. We also discussed that in the first seminar, with live links to the subjects you need. We've included in both the hub and the code, case studies and examples based on real-life scenarios, many of which were provided by stakeholders. The Annex A, also contains a data sharing checklist. This is replicated in the hub, and also Annex B includes template forms for requests and decisions. We've also included in the hub additional resources for SMEs, and we've created a law enforcement toolkit for sharing data with law enforcement or competent authorities. So I'm going to talk through a few examples from the code and then highlight some longer case studies in the annex. You'll need to read them for yourselves later, but I wanted to demonstrate the breadth of scenarios in the code and also in the new hub later on. So they cover public, private and social sectors. We were determined to cover a wide range of organisations, and they're based on real scenarios. We want to increase the number of case studies as well as other resources in the data sharing information hub. So an example, data sharing in the banking sector, featuring a fintech or financial technology company. Open banking enables businesses to offer services to customers using their personal data. So an example of a fintech company service helping a customer to save by automatically transferring money from their account to their savings every month based on an analysis of their spending. Now, this use of their personal data has benefits for the customer by increasing their savings and reducing inconvenience for them, and this all takes place within a framework that protects the customer's privacy. It also benefits the bank because it allows it to benchmark products against competitors and reach new customers more easily, and provides evidence for anti-fraud prevention checks and customer verification, which is also in the public interest. So benefit for the individual customer and benefit for the business. This example shows how organisations in different sectors, in this case private and public, can and should share data to safeguard vulnerable individuals. Several health professionals from different organisations and care businesses were involved in providing health and social care to a group of older adults. By exchanging information about recent changes in their behaviour from one of the clients, they identified a pattern of evidence indicating the person might be a victim of abuse. To ensure the safeguarding of that person, they shared this information with the person's social worker for further investigation. There are longer, more detailed case studies in Annex C of the code. And you can see a screenshot here from Annex C. It might be a little bit small for you, but this is a direct screenshot from the code, which you can look at later. And these include case studies about fairness and transparency, in this case, a supermarket loyalty scheme, on accountability, which is about an information sharing framework in healthcare. Another one about data sharing under the Digital Economy Act 2017 to prevent company fraud. I mentioned that in the Digital Economy Act in an earlier session. And multi-agency data sharing to provide better early help and support to children and families. Now let's look at your responses to the question I asked at the beginning about your awareness of the tools and resources published in and alongside the code. Jenny, do you have the results, please?
Unfortunately, Viv, I don't seem to have the results as yet.
Okay.
What I'm hoping is that everyone's well aware, but as they come through, I can let you know.
Okay, well, we'll move on, and we'll come back to this later. So we'll look at the data sharing checklist, which is in Annex A of the code and also in the hub. Again, you can see a screenshot of Annex A. We know from the consultation exercise we undertook and the call for views that the template forms and the checklist were well liked in the old 2011 code. So we've updated them and reproduced them in the new one. Annex A has this checklist you can use to keep track of the steps you're taking and what to consider. So, as I said, this is a step-by-step guide to help you decide whether to share data. It lists what to consider, including whether the sharing is justified, doing a DPIA, accountability, lawful basis, and you should look at ICO guidance on these. And you should use it alongside the code and the ICO guidance. Now on DPIAs, I just wanted to emphasize here that this is a very useful tool for you when considering sharing data, even when it's not mandatory. It shouldn't be perceived as a barrier or a burden, but as something that can genuinely help you and will also help with your compliance with accountability. Jenny, do we have any update on the answers yet?
We do, so keeping you waiting.
Okay.
They have now come through, so I can say we asked you, what do you know about the resources provided in the codes and the data sharing information hub? 17% of you said that you had no idea, 57% had a vague idea, and 26 had a very good idea. They knew what they are and where to find them.
Okay. Well, that's not bad at all, is it? We've got the code's so new and it's not even been laid before Parliament. Got a little way to go, but whatever your response, this session should help to improve your awareness of the resources and where you can find them. And I wonder whether your answer will be different after the session. So thank you, Jenny. So we've already done the checklist, so we'll move on to the template data sharing request and decision forms, which, as I said, were popular in the old code, so we've updated them and put them back in the new one in Annex B. This is the screenshot with an extract from these forms, and as with the checklist and as with the DPIA, they will help you in demonstrating your accountability. These are simple, clear forms to record the request to share data and the decision-making process. So keeping a record of the process is really important part of accountability, as you know. I wanted to talk about the Data Sharing Information Hub. We've launched the new Data Sharing Information Hub alongside the new code, with an initial phase of resources. Some are drawn from the code, such as the checklist and template forms, but there are other distinct items, such as data sharing myth busted, so that's further myth busting messages, more case studies, some resources for SMEs I'll talk about shortly, that's simplified guidance and FAQs for small organisations and businesses and medium-sized ones, and a brand new toolkit for sharing law enforcement data with law enforcement or competent authorities. We want this hub to become a live resource, continually updated. So as I mentioned, we produced a toolkit for sharing personal data, that's law enforcement data, with a law enforcement authority, otherwise known as competent authority in the legislation. We discussed with the police and other organisations what would be helpful to them in this context. It's aimed at small organisations and businesses who are asked by a competent authority, law enforcement authorities such as the police, but there are other sorts of bodies who come in that category, as the code explains, who are asked to share personal data for law enforcement purposes, which again we explain, with that law enforcement authority. And this might be something like a request for CCTV footage or staff records. So, for example, the police ask a small business owner for CCTV footage they need for a criminal investigation. The toolkit takes the business owner step by step through the process of deciding whether or not they can share the data. This includes looking at the principles, lawful basis, and it links out to our guidance, considering the correct legislation. In this instance, it is sharing between parts 2 and 3 of the Data Protection Act 2018. And the code, if you don't know and you need to know, the code does explain the distinction between the two. The toolkit also enables the business owner to record the decision-making process and generates a report at the end. These latter two help with the accountability compliance. Oops, excuse me. I've missed a slide. There we are. As part of our work on law enforcement processing, we've also produced in our resources specialist guidance on data sharing and with and by law enforcement authorities. And I'm not going to go into more detail on these here because you can see them on our website, but they have been produced to complement the code and the new toolkit. So this is, as the slide explains, data sharing between parts 3 and 2 and vice versa of the DPIA 2018. It features sharing personal data with law enforcement authorities, and that's a similar subject area to the new toolkit, but aimed at larger organisations. The toolkit is really aimed at smaller ones who may not have much knowledge of data protection law. It also covers data sharing and reuse of data by competent authorities for non-law enforcement purposes. So as I said, you should read that separately, but I just wanted to highlight this to you, which complements the code and the toolkit. As I've mentioned, we've also produced specific resources for SMEs. Sometimes small and medium-sized organisations and businesses are asked to share data or need to share data. We've produced simpler, clearer resources. Well, I think the code is clear, but we have produced simpler, clear resources for them to use. In the Data Sharing Information Hub, we put that guidance, which is tailored for small organisations and medium ones, which includes businesses and sole traders, for example. As you can see highlighted by the red rectangle to the right of the slide, there is a resource on data sharing code, the basics, which small and medium-sized organisations will find simpler to access and read. This does not mean they can't use the code, of course they can, but this is just a simpler version. And also data sharing FAQs, which deals with a lot of scenarios they might encounter. I also wanted to mention our regulatory sandbox, and there is a link to this from the hub. This is an ICO service to support organisations who are creating products and services which use personal data in innovative and safe ways. Data sharing has been an area of focus for the Sandbox in 2020 to 21. Keep an eye on our website for updates about applications to the Sandbox and approvals. So what's next? What's next for us? We intend to develop the Data Sharing Hub as a live resource to help organisations with more tools and resources and more case studies and examples. We want to receive more case studies from you, and we want to hear from you as to what sort of things you'd like to see in the hub. Please email your suggestions to us at datasharingcode, that's one word, all lowercase, datasharingcode@ico.org.uk. Now, as I've said, included in our plans are developing the hub with your help. We're also creating a resource for data sharing in relation to safeguarding children and working on an overarching data sharing toolkit. So that's in addition to the law enforcement one. We're also planning our forthcoming engagement with sectors and on different topics. So we look forward to that further engagement with you. Before we move on to look at the questions you've raised in the chat box, in summary, this has been a tour through the mini galaxy of resources that we've produced so far to produce the new data sharing code. It's a start, as with the code itself, and they all form a suite of practical guidance for you. We want to develop these resources, and as I've said, we want to keep the hub live and relevant to you. We have plans to work on more tools and resources, but we want you to work with us, help us to help you. Look out for future engagement events by sector and topic. And this is just a first step. We need all parties, data protection practitioners, organisations and government to work together with us on data sharing. Next, I want to look at the questions that you posed to us. Do you have the first question, please, Jenny?
I do, Viv. So yeah, we've had loads of questions coming through, which is great. So thank you to everyone who submitted a query. We obviously won't be able to answer all of them, but I'm going to go through some of the emerging kind of themes and questions that have bubbled to the surface. So a lot of people have been asking, could the ICO provide some guidance on how processors may be able to take advantage of controllers' existing data sharing agreements with other organisations?
Processors, well, the question about processors and controllers has come up in the earlier sessions as well. So an important thing is to remember that controllers and processors need to put an arrangement in place under Article 28 of the UK GDPR. If they want to include more data sharing provisions in that, they can, but we specifically stated in the code that the code is actually aimed at controllers. So the important thing is for controllers and processors in a processing arrangement first to adhere to Article 28. Now, as for existing data sharing agreements that controllers might have with other controllers, is that what you were asking? And they wanting to piggyback on those, is that what you were?
Yeah, so the example that's been given, it's a local authority has a data sharing agreement, for example, with an NHS trust. Mm-hmm. Is the processor able to rely on the data sharing agreement to share data with the NHS on behalf of the local authority, or would it be best to have a separate data sharing agreement?
I think, they wouldn't be able to just piggyback on that. They'd have to, well, as they're still a processor, for a start, they'd need to comply with Article 28 with that other controller, and that is their priority because that is an important requirement of the UK GDPR. But if they want to use some data sharing provisions, they could incorporate those provisions if they wished into that Article 28 agreement. But the important thing is the Article 28 agreement, because they're not a controller, they're still a processor, and that is their key obligation in the first place. They could include data sharing provisions in that if they wanted, but that's not their primary duty at this point.
Indeed, it's a sort of it depends question
yes,
as well,
yes,
isn't it?
Yes,
it depends what the existing good data sharing agreement is and how that relates to what the processor is doing. But yeah, exactly. It's all about making sure that you're complying with Article 28 and then looking to see whether the data sharing agreement is relevant, I would have thought.
Yeah, because data sharing agreement we recommend as good practice. It's a very good thing to do, but when you're controller and processor, you are specifically required to comply with Article 28, so you should make sure that you do.
Indeed. Okay, thanks, Viv. Other people have been asking, should we ask the police to correct any requests to share CCTV data that cites out-of-date legislation? So frequently, people are finding that the police, for example, are using older forms that refer to not the current data protection legislation, but, for example, to DPIA 1998.
Yes, they should be correcting that, and the police are pretty good on data protection legislation. Really, we do quite a bit of work with them, and so I'm a bit surprised to see that's happening. But it may be at a local level, so they should make sure it's compliant at least. Yeah,
it's a good reminder to review your privacy notices and make sure that it cites the correct legislation. Okay, so other delegates have been interested to find out. So one delegate asks, we are a private organisation and we consistently receive requests from utility companies and local council sub-processors for information relating to specific addresses and sometimes customer details for the purpose of debt collection. Are we required to disclose this information to them?
Their requests for they're not subject to access. They're requiring some data sharing by you. Well, I would say you need to. I would use the resources in the code. It's the data. There's data request and decision templates would be useful. The checklist. I think you really ought to be thinking about a DPIA. Don't just plunge into it. Think about this carefully. Do a DPIA or get them to do a DPIA. It's really important that you don't just jump into this.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, ultimately, you have to make sure that you're complying with the legislation and that you have a lawful basis for sharing that information. So,
yes, and you have to record that. So record all your steps is good practice, and it'll help your record keeping, and it will make things really clear. If depending on the type of data, well, data sharing agreement is good practice, even if it's just a one-off. If it's very sensitive data, you should be doing a data sharing agreement anyway, because it's not so much that it's one request, it could be the sensitivity of the data might determine that you should really do one. So seriously consider doing one. It's to help you. It's not a barrier. These tools I've mentioned, they're not barriers. They're to help you think through everything that you're doing.
Indeed, and if it is a legal obligation, I would imagine the utility company or the local authority that's requesting that information would be pointing that out, and then it's for you as a controller to satisfy yourself that that is indeed a legal obligation on yourself to share that data, and then you're obviously kind of following through on all the principles.
Absolutely. Look at the code, and it links directly to our guidance on each point, for example, DPIAs, and you'll work out if it's mandatory. They will be able to work out if it's mandatory or not, and it will help you just to follow it.
Okay, So we've had quite a few kind of complex questions. So let's look at another one. We've had a question about NHS meetings and sharing data about multiple patients and their needs within these meetings. The individual who asked the question highlighted that it's difficult to convince those involved that it is excessive data sharing. Any tips, Viv, on data minimisation and only sharing data that is proportionate?
Well, it's as the code emphasises, it's the data protection principles emphasise the importance of this, and you have to. It's really important that you comply with those. So I just commend you to refer to the code where it does stress the importance of this. You shouldn't be keeping too much data for too long, and you should review regularly the sort of information you hold in any case. But yeah, as any of you were in the seminar too will notice, we did discuss this in the COVID related example about minimisation, proportionality in sharing data in relation to vulnerable people for supermarket deliveries. So this is really important, and it's something that does take place regularly. So I hope that they will follow good practice.
Great. We've also got a question about ad hoc data sharing. So this is someone sort of saying they've read through the code and have enjoyed it, which is good to hear. But data sharing, they say, tends to be specific to the circumstances and the processing. For ad hoc processing, aside from keeping records of advice given and mitigations put in place, is there anything else that you would suggest, Viv?
Well, ad hoc is, obviously, if it's just a very small request, then we understand that apart from observing the important basics of data protection law, you might not want to go to the formality of a DPIA, of a data sharing agreement. But it isn't the fact that it's just a one-off request that is important. As I've just mentioned, it's a question of what sort of data is it. I mean, it might be about health, it might be about somebody's criminal record, political beliefs, religious beliefs, any of these things. So the type of data and the quantity of data are really important. So don't just look at it like an ad hoc request. I would also say that plan ahead. Somebody in an earlier seminar asked, should we have a data sharing policy in our organisation? Well, it's a good idea, because it means you set out clearly how you will handle requests for data sharing. Your DPO, or the equivalent person who deals with data sharing in your organisation, is your expert. You should be discussing it with them, and if you set out procedures for what you do, then that will mean you are prepared for these ad hoc requests. You won't be all at sea. Is that what you think they needed to know, Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking too, Viv. I mean, there's a question about to what extent that ad hoc data sharing could be anticipated, and therefore what kind of sort of policies and procedures you could have in place in anticipation of those kind of requests. They may not be frequent. It may not necessitate a data sharing agreement, but you can plan for it.
Yeah.
Okay. Another delegate asks, what kind of things do you expect to add to the data sharing hub over time?
Well, I mentioned we want to add greatly to the case studies and examples, and we would like to receive suggestions as to those from you. We also want to know what other resources you might put. We're happy to put in links to things that might be useful. So if you want to email us to datasharingcode@ico.org.uk with any suggestion you've got, we will consider them very seriously, and we welcome those suggestions. As I said, we're working on a resource regarding data sharing for the purpose of safeguarding children, and also a large overarching toolkit. We anticipate that it will be increasing quite a lot. We may even have sections dedicated to particular sectors for example, but we haven't firmly decided upon that yet. But it depends how much information we've got, how we'll organise it. But we do, it's very early days still, and we've already got quite a lot of resources, I think you'll agree, but we're very keen to expand it, and we're dependent on you to tell us what you want. We really want to hear from you. Thanks.
Thank you, Viv. So we've been asked about guidance on data sharing for safeguarding. Do we have any guidance that we can provide on data sharing in safeguarding situations?
Well, safeguarding is referred to in the code. I think we refer it particularly in the urgent and emergency data sharing situation. For example, it might be an urgent situation. It might not be strictly an emergency, but in an urgent situation, you should still aim to share data when it's fair and proportionate. It's just a lesser obligation, I suppose, but it depends on the degree. It depends. You know, safeguarding is can be to prevent harm. So it's really, really important that you do that and don't hesitate and deal with formalities later, so long as it's fair and proportionate. But it's something that we're very keen to produce, and we'll be working with other organisations such as the Children's Commissioner on children's safeguarding. There are case studies and examples. There's one on older people, vulnerable people in the code, and one's about helping troubled families in the annex. So it is something that we're very conscious of, and if we can build on that in the hub, then we will do. If you would like to see more, please do.
And worth mentioning as well, in relation to special category data sharing, for safeguarding purposes, there are specific conditions as well, aren't there, Viv?
Yes.
In the DPA 2018, which allow for that.
Yes.
When certain conditions are met.
Absolutely. Yes. So yes, don't be put off. Yeah.
Okay. I suspect we have about just over 5 minutes left, so probably time for one or two more questions.
Okay.
The next question I have is it a good idea for data controllers to check from time to time that third parties with whom they share data for one particular purpose aren't repurposing that personal data for unlawful and unexpected purposes?
Well, it depends on the compatibility of the purpose. There is guidance on the ICO website about this. I mean, as for unlawful, well, that's another ball game completely. Wouldn't recommend that. But for a different purpose, we have got guidance on the ICO website about repurposing, and it depends. It depends on whether it's compatible or not. As a compatible purpose, that decision would depend on the circumstances of the case. Is that what they were asking?
Yeah, I wonder if the question is slightly about checking from time to time what third parties, presumably these are other controllers that the controller in question is sharing data with, what they are then going on to do with the data. And I would have thought that would be part of your kind of review of your data sharing agreement. You should be having those discussions and just confirming that you are aware what the third party is doing, because it's part of your due diligence.
Well, absolutely. Yes. Sorry. Yes, I missed that point, didn't I? Yes, it's very important that you know at the outset who that data will be shared with. I wouldn't expect you to be ignorant of that fact. And yes, you should be monitoring the processing, the sharing of the data throughout, really, keeping it under regular review, making sure that what is happening to the data is what you agreed in the first place.
Great, thank you, Viv. I think that is the last of our questions. So we've come to the end of the key questions that came up to the surface in terms of this session. Okay,
well, that means everybody gets to have an early cup of tea tonight. So that's good. That's pretty good. Well, thank you very much, Jenny. If any questions do come in, and also there's any questions from the other sessions we didn't answer, we will put them on the Data Sharing Hub on our website in the coming weeks. And there will be a recording of this and the other sessions available too. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.